Hello and welcome to Quilting with Lori. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. Last week I shared with you a pattern that I put together using squares and strips. This is one of the blocks that we worked on last week. And this week I'm going to be showing you a block that I put together this morning using just the 1.5 inch strips. So the whole quilt will be made with strips. Let me show you what I did. So as you can see here, I have put together a quilt. It's basically rectangle blocks, and I'm using lights and darks, and it's creating these beautiful diagonal rows, and I think it's going to be a gorgeous quilt when I finish. I've really enjoyed putting this block together that we did last week, and I put a quilt together using that. But those small blocks just were not using my 1.5 inch strips as fast as I wanted to. I do have quite a few 1.5 inch strips in my stash. And as you know, I love to be able to create quilts using my scraps. And so I went through my stash and I still have lots of 1.5 inch strips. Therefore, I put this together this morning. It's a rectangle-sized block. In fact, if you look between my hands here, that is the block right here. It's 6 rows. It's 12.5 inches long, unfinished. In the quilt, it's 12 by 6. Unfinished, it's 12.5 by 6.5. And I've put together a combination of how to put the strips together, how to cut them, so that you can create the rectangle blocks. For each rectangle block, we're going to subcut the 1.5 inch strips, the lights and the darks, and we're going to cut 2 of each of these. And I'm going to show that to you here in just a moment. So here at my tabletop, you're seeing some of the things that I used to construct this block, and I'll get into that in a moment. This is the rectangle block. It is a 12.5 by 6.5 inch unfinished. And there's a certain way that I put this together. It resembles, or it's very similar to the Lady of the Lake. It's similar to the Mountain View. It's similar to so many different names of different blocks. But there's a certain way that I put this together to be able to accomplish these diagonal rows in this quilt. And I'm going to show you exactly how I did that. There are many different ways to put together any block. And typically when I'm teaching in a video, I'm just sharing with you one way that you can put together that particular block. So this is the 12.5 by 6.5 inch rectangle that we're going to be using. I will have a PDF attached in the description box for you, which tells you exactly what you need to cut for creating this block. Now, if you're not able to access the description box below the video here, no worries about that. You can certainly just go out to my website, quiltingwithlori.com, and go to the blog that corresponds to this video, and then you can pull the PDF from there as well as watch the video. So that's all available to you. Everything that I do is often where I'm teaching you how to use your scraps. And we all have scraps, and we all need to be able to use them up. And I've got a video out on my YouTube channel that teaches you how to scrap up your stash. And this is the corresponding techniques book that goes with that video. You can find the video if you go to my home page on my YouTube channel. It's the featured video on my home page, and you can watch that there. It teaches you how to cut, sort, organize, and get your scrap stash sorted and ready to use so that you can make beautiful quilts. This is a corresponding patterns book. Between the two, you get 17 patterns. So I'll have that linked below as well. You can go out and peek at that. For today's block, I am using my strips from my 1.5 inch strip bin. And I like to save when I'm cutting up my stash. I like to cut up strips that are 1.5 inches wide to 2.5, 3, and 3.5 inches wide. And the length of those strips can be anywhere from maybe 12 inches all the way to the width of the fabric. To me, it doesn't matter. I can use any of those lengths. And you'll see here in a minute when I show you how to put this block together why that's possible. All right, so let's take a look at that PDF. I have pulled lights and dark strips. Every one of these strips is 1.5 inches wide. And you do want to make sure, and some of the strips that I pulled out of my stash, I'd accidentally cut at 1 3/4 inches wide. So you might find that happening. So just check everything and make sure that it truly is 1.5 inches wide. And then you're going to subcut your light strips and your dark strips into these measurements. You're going to need 2 of each, of a light and a dark. That's a 1.5 inch square, so I have those here. These are the 3.5 inch rectangles. These are the 5.5 inch rectangles. These are the 8.5 inch rectangles. These are the 10.5, and these are the 12.5 inch rectangles. My block is going to be 12.5 inches long. And so as I put these together, what I did was I just sort of laid these out, and I made sure that I laid out every block next to me at the sewing machine in the same order so that I didn't get myself messed up or didn't start sewing something together incorrectly. And with this rectangle, it's important that every diagonal is sewn in the same direction. And I'll show you that here in just a minute. So I've laid these first 6 out here. Now we're going to take these smaller rectangles and we're going to place them on top of these larger rectangles. So the 12.5 inch is going to go with a 1.5 inch rectangle. And that's just simply going to be snowballed on there to create that point. So we're going to be doing that here at the machine in just a minute. Now these are the 8.5 inch rectangles, and I'm simply going to take the dark, and it's going to be placed here and sewn this way so that it turns into a 12.5 inch rectangle just like that. But for now, I'm just going to lay it this direction. This is the light and dark, so I'm going to place this here. I'm going to sew it that way, and it will turn out to be a 12.5 inch rectangle as well. For now, I'm just going to lay it here. I'm going to do the same with these. So this 5.5 inch green is going to go with the 8.5, and this light 5.5 is going to go with this 8.5. So I have them ready to sew. So now I'm going to transfer all of this up to my sewing machine, and I am going to make sure that I stitch everything starting here into this corner. I'm going to sew from here into this corner, and I'm going to do this assembly line. And then for this, I am going to place it up on my machine, and I'm going to start at this corner and sew up here. I'm going to do the same with this, right sides together. I'm going to start up here and sew to this corner. If I accidentally do this and sew it that way, I'll be creating a different diagonal. And I want all of my diagonals to be heading in the same direction. And I made that mistake when I first started putting the block together. And the first time you'll make it, then you'll see what I'm talking about. And it will prevent you from doing it again. I think we all have to make the mistake once, right? And here, this 5.5 is going to go on the 8.5, and I'm going to stitch it right there. This 5.5 will go on this 8.5 inch, and I will stitch it from here to there. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch these, and I'll bring it right back to the tabletop so you can see how it's been done. Let's take a peek at this. So I have them all stitched. I stitched from this corner here, and this is the 1.5 inch to the 12.5 inch. I just snowballed it, so that's the 12.5 inch rectangle there. I did the same with this second one. So now both the light and the dark rectangle are ready to go. I'm going to separate them here. So that's that one, and here is that one. So the 12.5 inch dark and light is ready. I will need to trim away this excess, so I'll do that here in just a moment. Now let's look at the 8.5 inch. Or excuse me, the 10.5 inch first. So the 10.5 inch, I sewed from here to there and from here to there with the 3.5 inch strips. There we go. And they will create 12.5 inch strips, 12.5 inch rectangles. I'll need to trim away this excess here. And then the last 2 that I put together, each of these blocks requires 6 complete strips. This is the 5.5 inch with the 8.5 inch. The 5.5 inch with the 8.5 inch. I don't think I put this one on here correctly. I think there's too much fabric over there. I might have to remove that and start over. I didn't start at the corner as like I should have. But these will both end up being 12.5-inch strips. And again, I will remove the excess here and press everything. I like to press all of these to the dark. So all of these will be pressed to the dark, all of these little seam allowances here. And I'm going to take this one apart and fix that. I'm going to trim away all these excess, and I'll press everything, and I'll bring it back and show you what it looks like. All right, here you'll see that I have sewn all the strips. I've pressed all the strips. I've cut away the excess. So this is that excess that you can cut away. These are really tiny. These could be put in my crumbs bin, or if you're making the pet pillow, which is in my techniques book, there's a pattern in there for a pet pillow. You can tape that or pin it somewhere in the area of your cutting table and then throw tiny pieces like that into your pet pillow so that it becomes the stuffing for the pet pillow. So that way you're not throwing this in the trash. So whatever you choose to do with those little crumbs. Now let's put the block together. And as I said earlier, I made sure that each and every block I laid out next to my sewing machine just exactly the same way so that I ensured that all of the strips were in the correct position and that all the diagonals were going in the correct position. So here I have a light 12.5-inch dark with the 1.5-inch snowball here. So that one is going to be at the top. Then I'm going to find the next one that has the dark. This is the 3.5-inch with the, I believe this was the 10.5-inch, a light with the dark. Then I'm going to find my 5.5-inch with my 8.5-inch. And then I need to locate my 8.5-inch dark with my 5.5-inch light. And then we have, this was the 10.5-inch with a 3.5-inch. And this is the 12.5-inch with the 1.5-inch dark. And I think you're not able to see everything. I'm going to get this down in the screen here. Now, I believe you can see everything. So as you can see here, all of the diagonals are pointing in that direction. The darks are pointing down into the lights. And if you're looking at it from the light angle, the lights are pointing up into the darks. So that's how I laid out each and every block. And then these will be sewn together, and they're just going to be sewn together like this to create the rectangle block that we're going to be using. Each and every block looks exactly like this. Obviously, the fabrics are all different because you want it to be as scrappy as possible, but it has to be laid out in this fashion to put it together. So let me sew these. I'm just going to put them together with 1/4-inch seam allowances. And half of the blocks I am going to press toward the light, and half of the blocks I'm going to press toward the dark. So you'll want to identify how many blocks, rectangle blocks, you need for the size quilt you're making. And just split that in half and then press half of them to the light, half of them to the dark. And they'll go together really well that way. I finished the block here. It's all ready to go. I've got it pressed. In this case, I have pressed everything away from the dark. And that helps when you're putting these rows together. I found if when you're putting your, I'm going to sew them together in columns. So we'll have columns here, and you're obviously just going to be sewing on the long ends. But when you're sewing these together, the two columns together, it's nice to have the option of nesting all of these seams. So that's why it's important to have one row of these going in one direction and the other in the other direction. So something to think about as you're working with it. But this is the block, and then as you're laying them out, you're simply going to be flipping them back and forth so that your lights are creating the beautiful light value going that direction, and the darks are creating this beautiful row or diagonal row going this direction. So you're just going to keep flipping them back and forth across the quilt as you're laying out your blocks. It works out beautifully. It goes together very quickly. What I was doing was literally cutting the strips, a light and a dark, for each and every block. And I would have my 12.5, 10.5, 8.5, 5.5, 3.5, and 1.5 inch strips all organized together, and I'd put them aside as a unit, and then I'd just continue cutting. And so I got all of these put together very, very quickly. And I love putting together longer strips like this because I'm actually using more of my 1.5 inch strips. And it really does go together very quickly. I love the result. I hope many of you will make it, and let me know. Please put some comments in the comment section here. Let me know what you're planning on doing. There are so many different variations and sizes. You can do so much with this. You don't have to lay it out this way. You can lay the blocks out any way that you want to. There's different patterns that you can come up with if you just create a bunch of these and go to your design wall, go to your floor, start playing with those rectangle blocks and see what you can come up with. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today and checking out what we had going here. I hope many of you will take a moment or two and just grab your strips and have fun with it. Create a beautiful quilt and then post pictures of the blocks and the quilts that you make out on my Facebook page. I have a group page. It's Quilting with Lori and Scrap Up Your Stash. So please post pictures out there. We'd love to see them. That really inspires all of us to be able to see things that everyone is working on. And leave some comments below. I'd love to hear what you're working on and what you might design using this pattern. Thanks again so much for stopping by, and we'll see you next time. And until then, happy quilting.